Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Raise the Vibe with Liz. I'm your host, Liz Peterson, and today we're going to be talking about energetic clutter with Tanya Cole-Lesnick. So for those of you who aren't familiar with I'm going to go ahead and read her bio. So Tanya is a psychotherapist, licensed clinical social worker, and personal development coach who is focused on helping people to pursue a life that honors their truest selves, is clear of energetic clutter, and that they are genuinely excited to be living. She does this by helping her clients to identify the limiting beliefs and behavioral patterns that take up mental space and demand energy, but don't help to move the needle towards growth, meaning, or how they want to feel. This is what Tanya calls energetic clutter. From there, she helps her clients to heal faulty narratives and change the habits that don't serve them so that they are living in alignment inside and out. Tanya's work revolves around a combination of group and individual coaching, as she believes that the sharing of inner worlds and being human together is a safe space collectively and individually is an incredible power method for lasting transformation. Awesome. Love your bio. Tanya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Liz. I'm really excited to be here and to see this conversation unfold.
Me too. I'm really looking forward to it. As I said before I pressed record, that this is my background. I really appreciated the group dynamic that we had going during my 4-year program. Since she was a psychotherapist, she incorporated that into our healing work. It was very much important for her to have us do our work so we could hold presence for our clients, like Barbara Brennan did in her 4-year training in New York City. So let's jump in. I really want to hear what your journey, what your process was to doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, it's been a long time. I mean, I've been doing this work for almost 30 years now. So when I first started my career, I was a graphic designer but struggling to have long-term love relationship and wasn't sure what to do about it. Wasn't sure what was in the way for me, and initially wasn't even comfortable with the idea of pursuing therapy. It was a long time ago. I felt a lot of stigma, and even though it was New York City where I was looking for this, which was probably the place that accepted therapy most of all back in those days, I still kind of dismissed my problems and decided that they weren't significant enough to be pursuing such a thing. But as time went on and I was still struggling with a long-term love relationship, I decided to give it a try. I got some names and got connected to a wonderful therapist and felt immediately safe in that space, started to share my story, did not feel judged at all. And that was really healing all by itself. But she suggested that I add group therapy to the mix, which really terrified me. But I was trusting her and she thought it would be helpful, and I was sort of intrigued. So I decided to give it a try. And it was life changing being in that space with other humans, going through their personal growth journeys helped me, number one, know that I wasn't alone. Number two, I had gone into that explaining to myself what might be in the way and thinking maybe I was unlovable. And so that was an explanation that I was sort of carrying around in my heart, not even maybe really realizing that that's what I was telling myself. But as I started to meet people who were sharing some of their insecurities, and I could see how amazing they were, it helped put this crack in my own story. And that really was life changing. I got more comfortable in my own skin. At that time, I met a man who became my husband. He and I just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary almost a year ago now, actually.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And we have 2 grown daughters. So that's why I went. I wanted to explore what was in the way and really get to a point where I could have a long-term love relationship. But the part that I hadn't anticipated was connecting to myself in such a deep way and having such a transformation inside my own skin that I decided to go back to school and I became a psychotherapist and also personal development coaching and have been doing that work ever since. So,
Oh, I
yeah.
love that. What a great story that led you to your personal passion and career. I love that. And I love how you shared that vulnerable piece of information about not feeling vulnerable. And it is really hard when you first go into group situation to find your space, to find your footing, to realize that that vulnerability, that openness and sharing in a group situation not only helps you and furthers your self-development, but also helps the group too. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that works for you and your groups?
Yeah. I mean, I think we can see ourselves in each other. And sometimes we can be so harsh with ourselves as well. So that when we see somebody struggling, perhaps in a similar way to how we struggle, we can have more compassion towards them first, but then that helps us start to have a little bit more compassion towards ourselves. So I think that's one thing that's so powerful about group. We go into the situation with other humans, not necessarily realizing that we're going to touch on some real tender points that we didn't go into that thinking that was the conversation for the day necessarily, but when we hear from other people and pay attention to what's resonating for us, then we can really get to some unconscious stuff, get to some deeper stuff inside of us.
I agree. That really is so true. You describe some of this deeper stuff that we have within ourselves as energetic clutter, which I just love. I was telling you before the show, like, I'm going to
Yeah.
start coining this term and borrow it from you because I think it's so fabulous, all of the energetic clutter that we can have. So, describe to our audience what is energetic clutter and how can we go about clearing that?
Yeah. What the quickest definition that I've been saying about it is that it's really all the stuff that takes our focus, our time, and our energy, but it's not helping us to move the needle towards growth or meaning or how we want to feel. So there are plenty of things in the world that take our energy, but if it's helping us be in alignment with our hearts and really has some meaning for us, or we really love the experience that we have with whatever those things are, those would not be energetic clutter because they're really enhancing our lives in this meaningful way. But those things that we're going maybe a thought loop where we can go round and round and round about different kinds of thoughts, like some of the limiting beliefs that we all have that we bring from our childhoods, from the families that we grow up in the cultures that we grow up in. And sometimes they get developed a little bit later in life with intense experiences. But limiting beliefs like I have to be nice in order to be loved, I have to hustle for my worth, or I'm not enough, or I'm too much. There's a lot, those are very common ones, and we all have our own nuanced versions of those. But yeah, and just helping people start to identify what's energetic clutter versus what are they really choosing because it's in alignment, it's connected to their growth process, or it's connected to something that they really want for themselves, and starting to identify which is which.
So, how would a person go about identifying these things? Because normally we're just walking through life, as you know, and not really paying attention to these things, even though we're having emotions around or triggers around some certain things in our lives. So, I want to kind of jog back to we are nice to be loved, that people pleaser, or we're
Mhm.
not enough. So we want to make sure we're doing this, that, or the other to make sure that we are. Let's dip a little bit into those limiting beliefs, what some of them are, and how you've helped people kind of see those and work through those personally in their lives.
Yeah, I think the best way in really are those pain points. So if somebody's really struggling with feeling depleted so much of the time, or irritable or resentful so much of the time, that's a great place to start and try and track some of those things. What else is happening during those times? What do you start to notice? Is it directly related to some dynamics with your partner? Is it something that comes up in friendships? Is it something that comes up a lot in work situations, or even all of the above? And just get a handle on sort of when that stuff is coming up. And when you're starting to notice those patterns and what's coming up, it can help us start to identify what's the story there. What are some of the things that are driving these patterns? So for me, people pleasing is definitely something that I had to get aware of, conscious of, and start to shift. Yeah. So, and that's something that what I had noticed is I would feel depleted because I would be saying yes to other people before checking in with myself and seeing where my energy level was. What did I want to say yes to? That kind of thing. And I would feel resentful sometimes because I would be accommodating to somebody else and it would kind of mess up the flow of my day or my week, and then feel somehow that they did something to me, and I was maybe feeling resentful, angry even, and realized, oh, wait a minute, this is part of that whole pattern. So starting to pay attention to those layers and starting to track them is the way to start this process.
So going deeper into those limiting beliefs that we have, what are some of the reasons why we do them? For example, people pleasing, we people please because we don't want to be rejected, right? So what are some other limiting beliefs that we can have, and why do we have these things in place? What are they functioning from?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think they're functioning from the messaging from our families, but our families also grew up in their families and they had cultures and we had cultures. So there's a lot of messaging that's in many cultures that has just lived on and on. So things like being productive is the better way to spend time, and that having fun or even calming our nervous systems is only something that we can do after we're done with our productive tasks that we have on our list, that kind of thing. So, where does that come from? Certainly, ideas in our culture. We celebrate people that are even martyrs, sort of, about like, I'm just going to forget my own needs. I'm going to just keep showing up and work crazy hours. And then we do as a culture often, I mean, we're learning and we're shifting, but often celebrate that kind of behavior, or perhaps they can connect to results sometimes, so that gets honored. I know in my own experiences, um, my father was really a workaholic, so that was and I really admired him, so that was something that I saw as kind of like somebody that I wanted to emulate. So that was part of it. With the people pleasing stuff, my mother was somebody who struggled with a lot of anxiety, and it often came out as anger and rage. So I learned early on not to rock the boat, to not do anything that might not be pleasing to my mother. And I kind of learned how to be more private with things that I didn't think she would like and show up in a way that I thought she would like. And so that was part of the dynamic for me. And we all have our own stories, but there's some similarities because there's definitely overlap in different cultures about some of this messaging.
And I'm definitely relating to the mother dynamic, growing up on the East Coast as well. And, having her be in her pain body or being frustrated and that coming out in different ways, and, wanting to, judge ahead of time which mom I was getting so I could prepare. And then that people
Hmm.
pleasing kicking in. And then what that does is it sets up patterns, that flow into our other relationships unbeknownst to us most of the time, because we're not at emotional maturity level when we're younger to realize that these things are flowing into our later relationships. So let's talk about those patterns and how we can take those dynamics from childhood and they just naturally just flow into our other relationships in life.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, they get so entrenched because we don't, I mean, you mentioned this, that we don't even question it really. We don't, it's just the way life is. And I think sometimes people think there isn't a choice. And that you just show up the way you show up, but then there's a lot of frustration and a lot of things that aren't working well. And just to even know that limiting beliefs are part of the layers, that if we're going to live our fully expressed selves, they are something we all need to kind of look at and make sure that they're not running the show anywhere for us. Just learning that that is a thing is really helpful, and it helps us pause. But I think, yeah, we don't necessarily even know to question it or look at it. And it does get so entrenched, and it makes it scary. We can understand on an intellectual level, oh, I got to stop saying yes to everybody, because if I don't do that, I'm going to keep getting depleted and resentful. We can understand that intellectually, but the process of starting to change that behavior can be dysregulating. I mean, it can bring up anxiety, and our nervous system gets activated, and it feels scary, because even if we think something intellectually, if there is some depth to this belief we've been carrying for a long time, then it can be really yeah, just scary, and it can bring some stuff up. But if we can be prepared for some of that, know that that's part of it, and let ourselves move incrementally through some of these changes and support ourselves through it, celebrate ourselves for any little bit of it, it can really help us be successful and get some traction with this shift that is going to really enhance quality of life.
Well said. And also, I kind of want to take this deeper into, having that awareness, following our triggers and our pain points, as you like to call them. I love that term. And really investigating, like, where is this coming from? Like, what is a process? What is a take home that we can have today about following that trigger and sort of naming or having that awareness of, what that cause is, where that comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it is really, the tracking part is the first step, and starting to track some of those things from the pain point. So I think starting with that, and then really getting quiet with it, with ourselves. I think journaling is an amazing tool. It can help us start to write and put on paper some of our thoughts, and it helps to sort of solidify some of what might be floating around in our heads. But as we start to write, it can help us through the process in a more intentional way, and starting to ask, well, what's the story here? What's that about? And exploring at all the different layers. Well, this was going on. Well, that was going on. What might have I taken from that? Does that resonate? And some of this stuff is, it's not just intuitive. It's intuitive, right? So some of this stuff is, when something clicks and it really resonates, there's a feeling that, I think if you're not used to connecting to your intuition, you may not fully recognize it until you start nurturing that. And so I think part of that is getting quiet, feeling. I feel my intuition often in my gut. I have this sense of groundedness when I'm connecting to my intuition and something feels right. And it's hard to explain. It's just a sense that something really resonates for me. And I wonder, for you, do you have a connection when you're feeling something really resonates?
I do. I sometimes, get that feeling in my stomach when I'm feeling very clairsentient about something. Inner knowing, my intuition comes through that way a lot of times. And then also, like, me just tracking my emotions, like, okay, I'm experiencing a trigger right now. Where have I felt this before
Mhm.
in my
Yeah.
life? And then taking it deeper into, the connection that it may have to my coping mechanisms, that I had
Mhm.
in my life, or attachments to maybe my self-worth, or, that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
how do you see, these limiting beliefs being attached to our self-worth and the way that we are in the world?
Yeah, because if we're engaged in these limiting beliefs, and they're kind of the lens that we're seeing things through, making our decisions through, we're not going to be honoring our hearts because these limiting beliefs tell us something different. So we're either honoring how fast we can move through something or how hard we can work on something or somebody else. There's a lot of other things besides our own hearts that we're paying attention to when we follow these limiting beliefs. And so then what happens? I mean, we mentioned the energetic clutter before. And so there's a real filling up of things that don't matter to us, things that feel frustrating. It's hard to really feel a full sense of satisfaction in our lives if we're not even connecting to ourselves. And so there's a lot that gets lost when we live that way. And we can be our mood can be impacted by that. Yes, self-worth. And then it becomes sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy because when we are living that way and we want more, if we don't clear some of that out of the way, then our efforts are going to not bring us to where we want to go because we don't have the full energy that we can put into that, or our heart's not really fully into that. So it can be really interrupt what we long for in our lives.
Right. I remember back to when this started coming online for me, parenting, all the children at home, being a stay-at-home mom, realizing I had kind of left myself behind. There was this process that I stepped into where I really had to get curious with myself because I'm like, okay, what are my needs and what are my desires? Because I was so much functioning in a space of looking out for other, as you were saying, looking out for the children, looking out for the home, looking out, for my partner and stuff like that, and not at the same time looking out for my own needs. So for a person who finds themselves in that space, like, what is your advice to kind of step into who am I? What are my needs and my desires? What do you suggest?
Yeah. It's funny as you were telling that story, I was sort of flashing back to my own young kids, my two daughters, and it connects right back to group. So when I was doing group another time, so the first time I did group for a while and healed some things and then went about kind of living my life for a bit and then came back and did group again when my kids were young, and my husband had to leave work early from the city. I live in New York. I'm about an hour north of the city, and he used to work in the city. He had to come home early to take care of the kids while I left my job in Westchester and went into the city. And it was uncomfortable because it was inconvenient. He didn't love that he had to drop everything to run home. And the kids were at that young age when mommy, 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 all they really wanted was me. And I had to really sit with some of that discomfort and know in my heart that it was good for their relationship with him to have this time that was just every week they had it together. And even if there were some hard moments getting to that point, and also for them to see their mother prioritizing taking care of herself. And so that's just an example of tolerating some of that discomfort that can come up. And I mean, with the limiting beliefs, we also have this belief in our culture of like our kids need care 24/7, and somehow we're dropping the ball if we're not doing that, which I think does a disservice to children, parents. I mean, I think that idea is harming people because then they're overdoing it, they're not taking care of themselves, and then the kids are getting over cared for. So I think there's a lot of room for people to start to take some steps towards yourself, even if there's some discomfort, but also because of the discomfort, to allow a pace that feels manageable, that it's fine to take tiny little steps towards doing some things to take good care of yourself, because just to honor that this is not easy.
Oh, I love that. And I love what you said about setting an example. You are modeling you taking care of yourself and having something for yourself, because so often I know I stepped right into the role 100% because of what was modeled to me,
That's
right?
right.
Not knowing that there was something different, not
Yeah.
realizing even, or
Mhm.
having the attention to see that that's what I was functioning from. at that
Yeah.
point, not
That,
until I really started to dive deep into what my family patterns were and what I was doing. So I think
mhm.
that's gold, talking about like, what example are you setting for your children? What are you modeling for your children? And like, that's what they're going to take into their future lives, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just thinking, I have so many clients, especially women, that have to learn how to take care of themselves and to even start to value what that does for your children, because there is such guilt that people express feeling when they are taking themselves away from their families and their kids. And it can be really hard sometimes for people to see how important that is and what the benefits are. So, and you mentioned in your family, that's what was modeled for you and sort of following that, and also what gets celebrated in our culture. One of the best compliments for a mom is how selfless she is, which
Yeah.
is a real problem that we kind of hold that up as such an admirable thing. And no shade on people who are struggling with that. It's a struggle, but as a culture to really celebrate what it looks like to start taking good care of yourself, to check in with your heart, to check in with your energy, and to show our kids how to do that so they can start to do that too.
A really important point, to point out right there, because we are shifting as a society out of a lot of those old paradigms and family dynamics. And it's so nice to see, there's more of a partnership going
Mhm.
on now in relationship. I think there's more emotional
Yeah.
maturity now, that's happening right now too, which really helps our society.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how can we bring that more into our life? How can we like shine a light on, the things that have been brought forward from society if
Mhm.
we're still doing them and make that shift?
Yeah. I do for myself and talk to my clients about doing this as well, just a daily practice multiple times a day of what do you want? What do you need? And so that as I'm going through my day and living my life, I kind of frequently check in with myself, because it's very easy for us to go down the path of the shoulds, or I'm not doing it right, or pushing towards something that energetically feels very pressured. And so in that practice of checking in with myself in real time as my day is unfolding, and same is true for anybody else who chooses to use this practice as well, there's a way of just kind of seeing what you want and need, pausing, pivoting if that's necessary, taking a break and going outside for a little bit of nature that can be really healing and can help turn a moment around. And nature is just one example, but that there are all kinds of ways that we can sort of connect to ourselves, our breath, journaling, calling a friend, sitting down. And I just rediscovered puzzles recently, and I'm really enjoying it, just doing puzzles, because it's so calming. And just like going over to the puzzle for a few minutes can just help me catch my breath and then feel more clear and more intentional about moving forward in my day. So I think developing, that's just one practice, but developing practices that help to ground us, connect ourselves to ourselves, and that kind of thing, and to have that be a regular part of our day-to-day lives, so that's happening throughout.
Oh, I love that you're pointing out some self-care there and some tools and tips that people can take home and put in their toolkits, because I think that's so important. And I'm hearing like the ability to take that pause, to get centered. Puzzling can be like this meditative practice where you just take that
Mhm.
pause of your day and it's clear your head because you're allowing your mind to focus on something else. So it becomes very
Yeah.
much a meditative journey. Same with walking or journaling or these other things that we can do to really self-care. What are some
Yeah.
of your favorite things to do, and some things that you've heard in group that we may not normally think of doing as self-care?
That's a good question. I feel like I've heard some things, but I'm not thinking what would be a normal. I have somebody that I work with who said she's really obsessed with, I've never done it myself, the old game Sims. Sims. There's like, she just gets really into playing Sims, whatever that is, as just a way to connect to her creativity and have a little bit of fun with that. So for her, that ends up being a really grounding tool. So I love that because it's so specific. And that when we start to identify our very specific things, you mentioned walking. I have had sort of love-hate relationship with movement, exercise, and have done many different things throughout many different years. But over the last couple of years, I've really loved hiking in this very beautiful wooded area near my home, but I've connected to a hiking group. So it's really a nice experience, especially because I do all my work virtually now, or most of my work virtually now. It's really a nice experience to have a little bit of community and start out the day in that kind of environment. And I have that sort of peppered throughout my week. So that's a really wonderful way of connecting. I love listening to podcasts, and I think that can be really helpful to especially ones like yours that are connected to, raising the vibe, that kind of helping you stay positive, helping you. I don't even love the word positive because I know there's a lot of toxic positivity stuff, but still, like, staying really in this vibration that helps us stay grounded, but also connect to our lives and our energy. And so, figuring out the specific ones, people talk about walking their dogs. I know one woman in my group plays soccer and she learns French. And so starting to identify what are the things that really just feel interesting, that engage you. You can get into a state of flow even with, can be really maybe different than grounding yourself, but it can be a way of just being in this very peaceful, balanced state and letting that be a layer that you include in regularly in your life.
Those are some great examples. One of my favorites is gardening. I've just moved a couple months
Mm,
ago, so I don't have a garden here at this home. But gardening has always, for years, been something that I can just go out. It becomes a meditative practice. I'm just in the dirt
yeah.
processing everything that's happened, during the
Mhm.
day. It's like a
Yeah.
clearing out, almost like a composting of whatever's going on in my life, right? And then just being able to just be clear when I walk through the
Mhm.
door after being in the garden. I also
Yeah.
like how you pointed out that group work, like searching out a group, a hiking group, because how
Mhm.
often do we think of this? I don't think, especially post lockdown, that people are thinking about groups and group
Mhm.
activities. So I'm going to bring us back around and use this as a segue about your groups and how, like, reaching out and really, like, becoming part of the community, becoming part of a group can really help us and kind of pulling us out of, that solo journey that often we find ourselves on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think group is, as you know, I think it's so healing. And then I do the groups and then I do retreats as well. And part of the reason why I love retreats so much, it's almost like the groups, but on steroids, where it's like this very intense, very contained sort of experience of really going deep together and connecting to each other. And so there's many different kinds of experiences that we can have in group. That's one where it's very deliberately, intentionally going deep. Whereas this hiking group is so light and we know each other because we overlap several times a week, or some go less regularly than others. So there's a bit of a catch up, and just having an ease with a group of people where you're not necessarily going deep, but you are really just enjoying the beautiful surroundings together and supporting each other, doing something that feels really good in our bodies. And so there's all kinds of groups that can be really nurturing and healing. Yeah.
And I like that you highlighted support, because a lot of times people don't know how to seek out support. There's
Yeah.
been a lot of death in our culture over the last 3 years, a lot of trauma going on.
Hmm.
And I've noticed post the passing of my mother last year, my inclination to, like, do it on my own and
Mm.
self-soothe. But then there's these opportunities for group work as well that kind of pull us out of, that societal conditioning that we've experienced. So how
Yeah.
do we, like, reach out if we're the person who wants to do it on our own, or we've been taught by society, just get over it and move on. What do you tell that person? What are the benefits of group, and how can they, like reach out to be able to do something like this?
Yeah. Well, it's tricky because I definitely have a lot of people that I work with individually that I would love for them to consider group and come to group. And initially, when the conversation starts, there's a lot of fear that comes up for the most part with probably most of the people that I bring this up to. And in fact, that's what happened to me as well. And we used to tease the therapist that ran the group that we were a part of as well, because we all kind of said that she would push us all into group. So I think there's definitely fear and resistance, and a lot of people go into that or resist that because they think they're either going to not get their full time, so that they're going to have to share time with other people, and they're not thrilled with that idea. I think there's a sense of they're not going to get their needs met in that kind of environment. There's that. And I think the other fear is being vulnerable with other people feels so scary. If they're working on tender things, it feels like, oh, can I really bring it to these people? And my experience, when people then deal with moving past that fear and come into the group situation, often what I hear from people afterwards is like, oh, okay, I get it now. Because that experience of starting that connection in such a safe space, I mean, that's such a priority of mine, to create a space that's safe for people to be vulnerable. And when they can be in that space with other people and feel so supported and feel so, people start to get to know each other, and they want to find out from each other how you're doing with this and how you're doing with that, because we're really sharing some of our journeys and we follow up with each other. So, yes, there's accountability, but there's also that celebration of how amazing you're moving through this. This is so great. And resonance. I mean, part of how I structure my group is I offer my groups run every other week. And then on the off week, I'll offer a topic that they can sort of spend the week thinking about. So, the topics are things like, what was the one? Losing track of what we've done. Oh, I know. The one that I am doing for tonight actually is energy vampires. Like, who are some energy vampires in your life? And it can be people and things. And let's just talk about that. So they've had a week to really think about how that shows up. I got a couple of emails nodding towards some in-law stuff is coming up for people. So I think that's going to be part of the conversation. But we have a conversation about what comes up, and what often happens. We have the topic. People go into what's currently happening. We start to explore what are some patterns that maybe have been lifelong. How did that kind of come to be for each person? And then after somebody's had a chance to share what they've been thinking about, the other people in the group will respond to what's resonating for them. So we're always connecting and finding the overlap and seeing where we see ourselves and each other. And that just can feel amazing to know how we're not alone in that, and to really feel that from each other.
Yeah, that really is a good feeling, that resonance, and knowing that you're not alone. And there is like little points, and gifts. When people share, they're
Mhm.
gifting the group an experience. There's always resonance. And then I find that as people share and open up and become vulnerable, it allows everybody else to open up and become vulnerable too.
Yeah. Yep. For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. I love
so
it.
if you're in the group, share yourself, because you're actually gifting someone the bravery to be able to open up and share themselves.
Yeah. And that being vulnerable thing doesn't go away. I'm just thinking, last year I went to a retreat that was run by this woman, Jennifer Pasteloff, who wrote this book called On Being Human.
Ah, I
And
know her.
she pulls together this really amazing community. And we were in this very magical, beautiful space. But just even having the experience, doing what I do for a living, and just pushing myself to stay vulnerable and to not go into coach mode or therapist mode, and know that I'm there for myself and trusting that I can open up with that. It's still vulnerable and it's a scary thing to do regardless, even though I know it's so helpful with the healing process. But then having trusted that and done that, what happens when people either during that particular workshop will say, "Oh, yes, me too," or share where they kind of overlap with some of what I had shared, or come find me afterwards to say, "Yeah, that thing you said, yeah, me too." And so, and I know that it wasn't just me, but that of course was my experience, but that's part of what's happening with all of us is we're coming back to each other to say, yes, thank you for sharing that. That meant a lot to me. I see myself there too.
And thank you for sharing that, vulnerable piece in yourself. Like even when you're sitting in circle, you're going, oh, it's time for me to share. I know I do that. You get that feeling in the pit of your stomach. And I remember hearing years ago, like if you're feeling that feeling in your stomach, if you're feeling that fear, that urge, that's actually your body's invitation that it is time to share, that it
Yeah.
is time to step forward and, have a voice and share within the group, which is, yeah, it can be a powerful thing, in the group situation to put yourself out
Yeah.
there and do that. And
Yeah.
I always find myself when I'm going to workshops now is having agreement with myself, setting that intention to be full out in the workshop. Because
Yeah.
I know looking back, when I was in my 4-year program, late 20s, early 30s, I was like, okay, if I went through that again, in my late 30s or 40s, how would I
Yeah.
have done that differently? So I try to bring that forward and be like, okay, I
Mhm.
held back then. So from now on, I'm fully invested.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And even when I run retreats, I do it with another therapist coach, and we both make a commitment and we share this with the people that attend that we do our own work too. We are there and we are present and we're able to hold space and we're there to guide other people through, and we're doing our own work because that feels so real and authentic, and it just is meaningful for us as well to pay attention to what comes up.
If you were to speak to somebody right now, you're working with a client, what would you say the benefits are to group work for them?
I would say a few things, and it depends too on the dynamic because what can happen sometimes if somebody, for example, has a tendency towards over caretaking, that will show up in group. So that can be a perfect opportunity to say if whatever my client might be struggling through, I might say this is an opportunity to really work on that in real time because you're very likely going to have the urge to take care of others in group, and we can name it while it's happening. And there's something so potent about being able to really touch on something in real time while it's happening can be so powerful. um, I think the unconscious part is so important, and I don't think it's something that can get touched on nearly the same way in individual, because there's stuff that you don't know is going to come up when there are other people sharing their stories. When you're in an individual therapy coaching situation, somebody's coming in, they're sharing what's been going on, the therapist coach, or in this case me, I'll respond, and sort of we have this back and forth conversation with the content right in front of us that we kind of decided on. It doesn't mean that we don't connect to other layers in there. There are other things that can come up and we can really get to some nice deep places. But in group, it's maybe a quicker journey, and it can be in this touching on some of this unconscious stuff when other people's stuff touches a tender point, and then it helps that person have that recognition of like, oh, wait a minute, I've got that too. I haven't even been thinking about that. And that's really something I want to start paying attention to. So it takes the work sometimes into these directions that are really healing and powerful, but that were not necessarily in the forefront of people's minds when they first came into it. So, yeah.
Yes, I love how it can take everybody deeper. I know that other people sharing has really taken me deeper on many occasions.
Yeah.
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 Definitely.
So,
And I love how group opens up those family dynamics. As you said earlier, if
mhm,
you're a caretaker and you find
yeah,
yourself in a group situation, you're going to be the one, if somebody starts crying, to go and grab that Kleenex
that's right.
Xbox and hand it to them. I have to laugh because in group situations, they have set up ahead of time, like, if you're a caretaker, your
Mhm,
job during this retreat is to take care of yourself. So if you find
yeah,
yourself inclined to go and get that box of tissues and give it to the person who's upset, you know, one, look at yourself, and then
mhm,
also look at how are you denying them their process to be able to self-care and take care of themselves,
that's right,
in
that's right, yeah, and that's one example of sort of a way people can show up. I know for myself, I struggled to take up space. It felt like, oh, I'll let other people talk. Their problems seem a little bit more urgent than mine. I'll just wait. And then after a while, like, wait a minute, I'm coming in every week from, my Westchester, New York into this group situation. I better speak up for myself, or what am I getting out of this? And really learning how to do that anyway, even if it didn't have this urgent feeling to it, which was part of the design. Like, to me, nothing really had an urgent feeling. So I could be on the back burner the entire time if I wasn't mindful about, like, oh, wait a minute, that's an issue for me. I don't tend to take up space. And that helped me then work on that in real time with other people. And the more you can name it together, the better, because then it kind of gives people permission to say, oh, there's that thing we talked about. And, group can be really helpful in that way when we let people know, oh, I'm working on this thing. And so this is what it could look like. And so let the group know. And that can be really just help to move it forward.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I love how you pointed out that taking up space, because that's something we normally don't talk about in society, also, where we were told, like, be small, be quiet, be
Mhm.
seen, not heard, because if you do, you're taking up space, you're too much, you're too this, you're too
Mhm.
that. And then that teaches us to not hold presence for ourselves and show up for ourselves when we're in these situations. So thank
That's
you for
right.
pointing that out. For somebody who also has that, what advice would you give them in order to, like, come out of that space, in order to step forward for themselves?
I would say naming it is a huge start, because just naming it alone can open up awareness to starting to catch it, see where it happens, get clear that it's in the way. I mean, I think as you start to name it and see, oh, wait a minute, this is happening here and there, see where else it comes up, and then give yourself full on permission to make that something that you're going to be intentional about working on. And what does that look like? If you're in a group situation, it can look like saying something, even if you think you're interrupting somebody, and that might feel a little bit awkward. And you're probably always going to feel like you're interrupted. Like, it's hard when you're not used to taking up space. It's hard to know when and how to jump in. So let it be messy at first. Let people know that you're working on that, and that you believe it probably will be a bit messy, and that you're still going to push yourself to do it. And then that will give you some, I think, permission to help you follow through with that. If you're not in a group situation, but you see that it shows up maybe with your partnership or in your family in some way, to set little incremental goals for yourself of, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just say my opinion, and whether or not they want to hear it, let's say it's with your partner, whether or not they want to hear it, I'm just going to put it out there, and that's going to be what I'm going to practice this week, and start to sort of identify little steps that are going to take care of some of the things that you identified where you are not taking up space, and learning from that, seeing how that feels and what happens from that.
I love that. Thank you so much for, walking us through that. It also makes me really curious, what other family dynamics show up in group work, and how can people work with those?
Yeah, I think sometimes if somebody feels left out quite a bit from family, they can take it personally and their feelings can get hurt with certain things. And so sometimes that will show up in the dynamic at group where somebody feels um not seen. And it could in fact, it could even go hand in hand with what we were just talking about, right? The struggle to take up space. Part of that could also be in this family where you felt invisible. And so some of that, somehow the dynamic gets started. So that kind of thing can happen. Um, Not feeling heard and seen and understood. That can be something that comes up for people, and sort of the struggle of how to put themselves out there to trust that, to feel like it's safe enough to do that. Um, there's definitely substance abuse issues in many families, and people come into groups maybe sometimes needing to feel a sense of control. That can be part of what grows out of that kind of family situation, or feeling very uncomfortable with a lot of unpredictability. And that was part of what they grew up with. And those two go hand in hand. The control with the unpredictability piece, and that can show up in groups sometimes. Yeah. I'm just thinking a lack of patience with some of the content sometimes, but I'm not quite sure what that might connect to in terms of family dynamics. But just, realizing that there's maybe some rigid ideas about how things should be, and some real frustration can get kicked up if something, not necessarily between the people, but if some of the content comes up and it gets really frustrating for people, there can be a um sort of a more intense reaction sometimes if somebody feels more intolerant, if feels more intolerant, and there's some rigidity around that. And that's probably some of the family dynamics that somebody grew up with as well.
Thank you for that explanation. I like that because it shows all the different ways that somebody can show up
Hmm.
in a situation,
Yeah.
right? Because we're all so different. We don't fit in a box. And yes, we have similarities sometimes, but there are different ways that we can show up depending on the situation.
Yeah, for sure. And then I'm thinking, when you're saying that, I'm thinking, oh, yeah. I mean, part of what's really powerful about group is the mirror part of, like, when we show up, however we show up, and people that are starting to really get to know us on this very deep and intimate level know how we typically show up. So if there is something that feels more intense than usual, or they seem a little bit more angry or intolerant of something, it's a very worthwhile conversation to start to have. And as we know each other, it becomes safe enough to have that kind of conversation, because we can say something like, huh, that seems different for you. You seem really sort of intense about this one. And then we can go deeper and really explore it. Or even the reverse, when somebody is starting to do some significant healing, and that we can notice, even virtually, we can notice that they are in their bodies are looking much more at peace, and we can feel that energy. We can give each other feedback about that. So that mirror and how people show up and being able to comment very specifically on it is another thing that's really powerful.
Plus, it's a great practice in communication when you're in a group.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think of it as like a microcosm of our world outside of group. So it's like we can do like this little bit of practicing in group, get comfortable with it, get clear about what our truth is connected to some of that, and then feel ready to go out to, if there was something we wanted to practice that we wanted to eventually say to our partners or something like that. Yeah, group can be a really great way to practice some of that.
Do you ever work with boundaries in your group or have people bring up boundary conversations around their needs and desires? And what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, it usually looks like talking about probably a lack of boundaries and the impact. So that's usually where it starts. And somebody might be sharing how frustrated they are, or how hard it's been with a particular person in their life. And then it starts to be part of the conversation, starts to come around this idea of setting boundaries. And I think setting boundaries can be really overwhelming for people to think, okay, yes, often it's something they've thought of already. It's something they've said before. It's something that maybe they've even tried before or they haven't tried because they haven't felt ready. And there's a real struggle often around, oh my God, how am I going to do that? That feels so hard. I'm afraid the person's going to be angry with me. I'm afraid the person's going to be upset with me. And what we often will work on is, what's a really small step just to start the process and move in that direction? And also, what kind of language feels to be the most in alignment with what you want to say and how you speak, and help them find their own words? I think it's so important for all of us to find language that works for us, that feels true for us, that we feel grounded using. It adds to our own strength and our own clarity of it being in alignment with us. So I think really spending some time with that to identify. I encourage people sometimes to sit with a notebook and write every different way they could imagine saying something, and then start to pick out which are the ones that resonate most of all and what feels the truest to you, so that they can go into a situation really being having some clarity on what they want to say. Whether or not in the end they use it or not, it almost doesn't matter. It's more about them sort of getting to a place of real clarity and real strength behind what they want to communicate.
Plus, it helps us work through, possibly where we might be coming from when we're doing that
Mhm.
process, right? Like, what's our
Oh, yeah.
intention with why I want to share this? What boundaries do I
Yes.
want to have for myself, but also with this person, and kind of work out everything. I find that is a great self discovery tool.
Yeah, 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 and even when you were saying the why part, because I was thinking that earlier when we were just talking even about if you're struggling to take up space, I think knowing why you might want it to be different also is really helpful, because we're not just doing this as an exercise in like personal development. There's no need to develop personally if it doesn't also do something for, our connection to being alive. And so what is that? What is it that we're wanting, and what can we envision working doing some of this work can bring for us?
Oh, that's a wonderful thing to point out, the value in the work and what is our desired outcome for the work that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, I think
So
that's so important. Tanya, this has been such a fabulous talk. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it was everything that I hoped it would be. And I hope that our listeners also gained as many nuggets during this conversation as I did, and some tools for my toolkit as well as theirs, which is super fun. So thank you so much for joining me
th-
today.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it as well. And I always love to hear sort of what maybe some of your thoughts are. And so I appreciate hearing some of your journey as well.
Thanks, Tanya. How can people reach you and to work with you?
The easiest way to find me is my website, and then there's some goodies on there and it links you to other social media stuff. And I have an easier to remember URL, which is clearenergeticclutter.com.
Oh, I love that. Clearenergeticclutter.com. And I really do love that expression. So
Yeah,
glad you brought that
awesome.
into the collective consciousness.
That's awesome.
So fun.
Thank you.
And one more question before we go. I always ask my guests, what is a jewel of wisdom that you would like to leave our listeners with today?
Ah, I think I say this so much, but I see people struggling with this, is really be kind to yourself. I think people don't even realize sometimes how harsh they can get towards themselves. And when we slow this work down and we look at what's happening and start to name some things, I have heard, and I've done it myself, um, just harsh ways. Feel like what's the matter with you is probably the one I hear most of all. But just to be kind to yourself and catch some of that, and don't allow that to be an unconscious way that you connect to yourself.
Oh, that's beautiful, Tanya. Thank you. It's so hard when we get into self-criticism to,
Yeah.
yeah, have compassion with ourselves during our process. I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining me today, Tanya. It's been a pleasure to host you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Liz Peterson, and this is Raise the Vibe with Liz. You can find me at raisethevibewithliz.com if you'd like to find out more information about me, my social links, and how to work with me. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Tanya. And remember to get out there and raise the vibe. Thanks, everybody.